Kijk, Canada, Amerika, Uruguay. Je ziet in Spanje al enorm liberaal beleid. Je ziet het in Zwitserland, je ziet het in Denemarken, je ziet het in Portugal. We worden in Nederland op dit moment op de vluchtstrook ingehaald.
Things have happened so remarkably fast that I don't think you can slow that down.
The nation's very first cannabis cafe is open for business in the city of West Hollywood.
What do we see right here?
So right over here is going to be the vape section. You can also find edibles that have CBD and THC in them.
We gaan internationaal, dames en heren. Dat hadden we al aangekondigd. Het tweede debat van vandaag. Hoe staat het met regulering en legalisering in Canada, Amerika en Duitsland? En wat gaan we leren van hun ervaringen? Welke trends, consumentenvoorkeuren, ontwikkelingen zijn er zichtbaar daar in dat gelegaliseerde deel van de wereld? En hoe kijken ze naar ons? Dat is ook wel aardig om te weten. Nou, grote vraag uiteraard. Ik heb al in het vorige debat gesteld. Wordt Duitsland de gamechanger voor Nederland of voor Europa? Ik ga allereerst de sprekers die we hier aan tafel krijgen aan u introduceren. En daarna gaan we in het Engels over. Georg Wurth is de bekendste cannabisactivist van Duitsland. Richtte in 2002 het Duitse Hanfverband op. Uitgegroeid tot de grootste organisatie voor de legalisering van cannabis in Europa. Hij won in 2014 €1 miljoen bij een televisieprogramma, Miljonairswaal, waar hij het geld gebruikte om een enorme campagne op te zetten. En zie waar hij daarmee gekomen is, want hij spreekt regelmatig parlementsleden, gezagsdragers, zeker sinds de huidige legalisering van cannabis voor recreatief gebruik heeft aangekondigd, nog even langs Europa. Georg Wurth. En u ziet de andere gasten al binnenkomen. Hilary Black in 1997 richtte zij in Vancouver, in Canada dus, de British Columbia Compassion Club Society op. De eerste dispensary voor medicinale cannabis in Canada. En het zou nog tot 2001 duren voordat de Canadese regering medicinale cannabis legaliseerde. Nou, behalve een mega-wietwinkel waren ze ook nog een wellness center waar therapie konden worden gevolgd. Daarna ging ze in 2015 werken bij Canopy Growth, een van de grootste cannabisbedrijven ter wereld. En daar is ze sinds dit jaar weg. Heeft zich helemaal tot Chief Advocacy Officer opgewerkt en ontving een mooie prijs in 2012, de Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Award. You're not wearing that at the moment. No. But still you got it. En dan hebben we, last but not least, Bob Hoban. En toen cannabis legaal werd in Colorado, besloten in Denver werkzame advocaat Bob Hoban zich te specialiseren in al het juridische rond de cannabisindustrie. Richtte de Hoban Law Group op, zijn eigen kantoor, helemaal gespecialiseerd op het gebied van cannabis. Hij doseerde over cannabisregulering, wetgeving aan de Universiteit van Denver en is inmiddels betrokken geraakt bij de ontwikkeling van beleid, legaal beleid en vormgeving in meer dan 30 landen. Hij komt op veel congressen en gelukkig hebben wij hem ook. And now I'll change over to English. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
First of all, Georg, I want to know, because we've been discussing Germany also in the last debate, Eckpunkte. What can you tell us what does this new law perhaps is going to mean for the consumer and the entrepreneur in your country, in Germany?
Well, it's about full legalization. I mean, that's probably the main message. We might become the third country in the world that completely regulates the market, behind Uruguay and Canada, and some US states, which is not a country as such. We have some others now coming up, trying to become the third one, or others who are long struggling for it, like Mexico, for example. Since years and years, they tried to make such a law and don't get it done. And I'm not sure if Germany will get it done. We have some problems, some hurdles.
Small hurdles, meaning the European Commission.
That's one of them. I think there's even a bigger hurdle, which is our second chamber of parliament. It's a little bit like in the States, where you have the House and the Senate. And the Democrats got the House and not the Senate, where the Republicans still have the majority, and that's why nothing is going forward. Although the Democrats want to legalize and have the president and everything, but they can't get it done without the Senate. And we probably will face the same problem with our Bundesrat, where the several regions have their say, and there still the Christian Union has a majority, can block the whole story.
Yeah. So we
and they probably will. But as you said, of course, also European law is a bigger hurdle than we thought before.
Yeah.
Like all the law professionals said us, well, there is international law, there is United Nations law, and legalization does hurt it. But as we saw, that's not really a problem. You can even ignore it, like Canada. Nobody cares. You just get a letter from the UN, and that's it.
Yeah.
So, all right, there are bigger problems than that. But now we see European law seems to be a bigger problem. At least they make it a bigger problem.
Yeah.
They say it is a bigger problem, and
but
there are very different opinions if that is really a problem or if it is made up.
Yeah, or a political problem.
Yes.
Let's face it. It's mostly a political problem. I think.
I would
agree.
also say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Hilary, you have been one of the engines behind the legalization of cannabis in Canada. We can state that easily, I think. What would you say to Georg? How does he have to fly that particular part in the discussion?
Well, there are some incredible documents and submissions that collections of physicians and lawyers and experts put together in Canada to deal with probably some of the same arguments that you're going to come up against as you're trying to move this through, your version of a House and Senate. And I think we probably have some very good resources that we could deploy and share. They need some translation, including some of the very high-ranking officials and senators who were incredibly important around getting legalization done. Senator Tony Dean, for example, he's somebody who should eventually come out to Germany and I think come and meet some of the folks that you're having resistance with. I could think of a whole list of people and resources that we had to use to sell legalization through our conservative government that could be very useful.
We are looking very closely to the data coming from Canada and using it already, but the ones who are against are not very interested in facts, let's say. It's an ideological problem, and you can talk with the wall with your facts sometimes.
And you have faced the same problems, obviously, Bob.
Obviously, the same problems exist.
How did you turn those people over? This because it's more feeling than facts.
Well, the facts always get in the way, but the politics is the problem, right?
That's right.
Everything gets politicized. I mean, just one thing I want to note about the German program, and this is interesting to me. This is political as well, I would think, that there are THC limitations for the ages of the users.
Yeah.
Where does this stuff come from?
No more. No, the actual official draft of these points
didn't contain that.
Yeah, they
corner
dropped
points.
it.
But what corner points? Eckpunkte. Yeah.
There's no THC level left. That was a leaked draft 1 week before.
Okay.
Now they say let's prove THC limit for 18 to 21 aged people. But it's not like we want to do it. We want to prove it. And the leaked one was 15% THC level for everybody. And of course, we said, well, that's a no-go.
Right.
You want to get rid of the black market, not that way. And they put it out.
So, but it's political issues like that and creating different THC limitations, I think, that always get in the way. We were talking about the United Nations. The UN had recently reclassified cannabis in November of 2020. They added the medical recognition, and of course they said that cannabinoids that come from industrial hemp that are not intoxicating are not subject to UN control. So those are some things that are changing, but it'll be very fascinating to see how this European Commission analysis shakes out, because many countries, many states, they just do it. What's the saying? Shoot first, ask questions later. This is the cowboy mentality behind what's happening in many places. But I would still argue, coming back here to the Netherlands, where I've been coming since 1993, the coffee shop model is still probably the ideal model for the distribution of flower and for the social component. In the U.S., we're trying to invent lounges and consumption clubs. Las Vegas is going to be an interesting experiment in that. Is that really the model? Will people really go there? Because you can't buy cannabis there necessarily. You have to buy it here. You have to go there. It misses that experience. Yeah. So to have the perfect model in place in the Netherlands,
you should have coffee.
Yet there's no regulation, it doesn't stand to reason.
Yeah. And why don't other countries, Canada for instance, you don't have coffee shops as well? Huh?
No, we don't have consumption sites. And I want to just talk about the UN, the way that, I mean, just to step back for a minute. When we legalized cannabis in Canada, it is not a perfect regulatory scheme. It's not free or inclusive enough as far as I'm concerned. In order for us to sell legalization to the conservative parts of our government, we essentially, I think, legalized cannabis with a prohibitionist mentality. The sell was we're going to regulate cannabis to reduce its harms, right? That's a very different approach than saying, oh man, this prohibition business is based in racism and lies and was like exported out of the US around the world and has destroyed like countless lives and families. And we are so sorry. This was a huge mistake. No, let's back it up and start again, right? That is not what happened in Canada. So to deal with the UN, there's a clause in one of the treaties that's about the protection of children, and we framed legalization as we're going to regulate it, and one of the priorities is to get cannabis out of the hands of children, get the money out of the hands of criminals. We're going to reduce the harms of cannabis through the way that we're regulating it, right? And this actually turned into some very big systemic problems, which is now making the industry not very healthy and successful in Canada. So, I mean, I have a lot of things that I want to share about how we can improve on Canada, but there are also some tremendous successes. So this pitch that we used with the UN and with our conservative government and said, we're going to reduce the harms to youth through control and regulation. I think we did get a letter from the UN, but it didn't have any teeth, right? And what's interesting is that 4 years after legalization of recreational cannabis in Canada, youth rates have stayed the same, and some very recent evidence is actually showing a drop in youth rates between the ages of 14 and 18. And I think it's because cannabis just got boring, right? Like there's government stores that are selling it, they're talking about it in schools, there's drug education about it, but for whatever reason, we actually have very solid, good data and statistics that shows that through regulation, we did not give the impression to youth that cannabis is great for everybody, but we've actually made it kind of boring, and there's in fact less youth use.
But that's the way you also sell the policies in states, in other states. You help, Bob.
Yes,
it's the same thing.
You have
make
to
it boring.
You have to make it boring. You have to, but you're right. The numbers do go down. I mean, teenage use of cannabis in states that have regulated marijuana, legal sales, the numbers have not gone up, and in fact, they've even declined a little bit. I just want to add two more elements to the UN debate. We talked about children. The idea of public health and national security are also influential arguments at the United Nations, which presumably would also apply to the European Commission. I'm not precisely sure, that's not my legal expertise, but I can tell you that the idea that creating a commercial regulated market where the product is consistent, it's safe, it's sold the same way every time, that goes towards public health, and it eliminates what might or might not be in black market or illicit marijuana. Furthermore, if you look at the national security issue, particularly in Latin American countries, this has a direct bearing. Creating a regulated marketplace versus an illicit marketplace tends to bring things above board and stabilizes them. So,
you know what I learned since I was here, which actually blows my mind? A lot of things. I've been hanging out with some very informative people. But that lab testing cannabis in the coffee shops here is actually illegal.
It's not allowed.
It's not allowed.
Right.
It's which is
so
just
you
that
can't say anything about
mind.
quality. You can't say anything what's coming through the back door.
Let's not make sure that it's free of pesticides or heavy metals or microbi. Like you just really have to be able to trust your supplier. That blows my mind.
Yeah, it's like buying a can of soup and we don't know what's in it. But if you warm it up, it'll be soup. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, so we pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
We discussed in the previous debate. We discussed the policy and also the steps the cannabis entrepreneurs should or should not take. And if I hear you, is it make it boring, and also enhance the fact that you see that regulation of cannabis, legalization, leads to social security, social advantage you don't have if you try to control the market. Okay, but how do you go about? We have these we reverse engineered. We have coffee shops first, and now we have to talk about the policy and turning the policy around.
I think
You have always came from nowhere and went up. And we came from somewhere up there, and now it's all.
Not to interrupt, but just on that point.
Yeah.
Every country, every jurisdiction needs its why. Why am I legalizing this? And it's different everywhere all the time. Sometimes it's for social or criminal justice reform. Sometimes it's to open up medical uses for patients. Sometimes it's for jobs and the economy. So you have to identify the why to understand how to accomplish it. And there has to be some consensus about the why. Because the Netherlands has had this struggle with the coffee shops and the regulation and the shifting policies and politics behind it, what's the why? Why change the way things are? And if you can answer that, then you can get to a set of regulations that most people will probably understand, if not agree with.
And that's the why you already also posed in Germany, Georg.
I think for the Netherlands, the why is clear, because in Germany, that is one of the stories of our enemies, saying, well, if you do that, you get Netherlands circumstances.
Germany will be a narco state. We've been called a narco state.
Maybe somebody's heard of Rainer Wendt, who is a very conservative police association leader, always says that if you decriminalize and if you don't. And if you legalize, then you have circumstances like in Holland with all those gangs shooting people on the streets and lawyers on the streets and so on. As if we in Germany wouldn't have criminals selling cannabis and shooting people in the streets. So we have the same, of course. But now they completely don't look at the fact that that the Netherlands are a nation which is doing trade since decades and
early 70s.
Hundreds of years, and has big havens and ports where tons of cocaine's coming in, and that's making the criminals rich. No, it's all because of the coffee shops that makes the whole country completely rich. I was surprised coming here to the station in Eindhoven, seeing a nice city, no criminals. I felt safe. I don't know. Something's wrong with this.
That is Eindhoven de gekste. That's a totally different thing. No, but I ask you the why, because you were actually one of the advocates and one of the activists that helped turn that story around. And now suddenly the German government also sees the why. What did you explain? How did you convince them that there's a why? And which why did you sell?
We used many whys. It's always the case whom you are talking to. If it's the conservatives and liberals, you're talking about the economical advantages. If you talk about with left and Greens, or let's say more left, you talk about civil rights and what happens with all those people who get harsh repression from the states for doing nothing, for hurting nobody. And if you are talking to Greens, maybe you talk more about health and what a black market means for quality of the stuff, and what that means, what risks that has for children and so on. I think we used them all, and they all had their worth in this debate. And at the end, we made it to get a majority of public behind us. That was something I always wanted to have. As a Democrat since 30 years working I started my political life in a party, and I was always a convinced Democrat, and I didn't want just to legalize, but also to have a majority of people behind me when we legalize.
Yeah, okay.
And for a long time, I had to say, well, you are right, we don't have the majority. And since 2014, I fortunately can afford to ask every year with a well-known institute, what do Germans think about legalization? And that year, 2014, we had 30% who said, well, we want shops for adults like in Colorado. And last year, in the middle of the negotiations of the new Ampel coalition in Germany, we had the first time the narrow majority of 49 to 46%, I think.
Okay.
So that was our work all those years, also coming up to those 30% in 2014. I think when I started the whole thing with my work on it, it was probably below 20%.
Yeah, okay.
And all those arguments helped us.
Yeah. You were writing something down.
I have something to say. It's true.
Come on.
I'm just bursting at the seams here. I think that it's very important that we watch our language, when possible, both in Germany and in Holland. And I've been hearing a lot about competing with the black market. So a couple of things. First of all, let's try to not call it the black market. We can say the unregulated or the illicit market. Just calling a market a black market is got racist roots. There's enough racism that's like embedded in through prohibition, so let's just take that out of our language. And also this whole notion of competing with or knocking out the legacy market, it doesn't work. We have to come from an approach of being as inclusive as possible. A regulated market has to have the products, the price, the potency, everything that's available in the unregulated market has to be available in the regulated market, or people just aren't going to consume from a regulated market. In Canada, we're now at about 60% purchases from the regulated and 40% from unregulated, which from a public health perspective is actually, from public policy, is actually quite successful. But what we did in Canada when we first legalized for medical, which is when we had the first big companies that were able to get the licenses, is there was 12 companies that were given big licenses. And those RFPs, the requests for proposals, what was required in order to obtain one of those licenses, there was massive barriers of entry. You had to have a huge amount of capital. You had to have all of your leadership go through these incredibly rigorous security checks. Basically, nobody could have ever touched cannabis before in their life, or they're not allowed to work at these companies. You had to build a facility that was like bomb-proof, essentially.
Fort Knox too.
The surveillance, and what has happened is the barriers to entry that kept smaller growers out in the beginning, that started to change because eventually we created some legislation for what we call micros, which is a maximum 2,000 square foot canopy, slightly less restrictive, like security requirements. But the micros are slowly coming into the market, and they are eating up the market share. Right, so the three biggest companies, of which I worked with one of them for 7 years until the spring, the market shares of those biggest companies are going from in the last few years, from 30-something% to 5 or 8%.
But they've also shifted away from the Canadian market and focused on the U.S. market.
Some have, but not very many of them are profitable, right? Most of those companies are still showing hundreds of millions of dollars of loss a year. Capital has dried up. Very few people are investing in the Canadian market anymore. And I believe it's because it's overregulated and overtaxed. So it's very hard to run a profitable cannabis company, and there's a bunch of reasons. Vertical integration, so in the beginning, those first licenses, you had to do everything from seed to sale, rather than being able to niche out. We're sale, we're doing processing, we're doing white labeling. Right now, some companies are able to niche out a little piece of the business, and they're starting to do better. The surveillance and anti-diversion that's required is basically why don't you just use those regulations for managing plutonium, 24 hours of surveillance, biochecks, really highly qualified people that have to be around in the room whenever the cannabis is there. There's a lot of micromanaging of the companies that make it very expensive. And then the tax in Canada is insane. So the way that the taxation works, both federally and provincially, is companies are being taxed 30% off their top line. When you go to buy a product, it can be up to 40% in tax. And there's a huge push happening in Canada right now because they're doing a review of the regulations. And particularly the small companies are really freaking out about some of these things that have to change. Or the fear is that there will be a couple of very large companies that have financial war chests, like the one that I've been working with for 6 years, that will have a long enough runway that they'll survive, and then you'll end up with a bunch of amalgamation and have 2 or 3 big companies that own the whole industry, which is not where I think the cannabis community, the legacy market, the people in this room really want to see the industry go. And I don't think it's also what consumers want, right? Consumers like to have a relationship with the company that they're getting their cannabis from. They want to know what the values are. They want to know like where you come from, what's your cool factor. So it's tempting to overregulate in the beginning in order to say, okay, we're going to treat cannabis like plutonium, and we're only going to let, these kinds of companies that are very clean and have never had anything to do with the criminal market and have a huge amount of capital, but in the end, it cuts you off from the knees, and you don't end up with a vibrant, healthy company.
Well, you're obviously known to the fact that we have a weedproof. We're trying to get this organized and experiment with certain growers that get a license to grow on an experimental base. So this is one thing they should have in mind. Please look at the Canadians, because they've been there, done that, have the T-shirt, and they're not very fond of it.
The second big story of our enemies, the conservatives in Germany. One was those Netherlands circumstances, and the other was look to Canada. There is still a black market, it doesn't work. And one even said, now they have 2 markets, the black market and the other market, and they are even competing, and it's a double problem than before. And then we had to explain them, well, every single percent changing from this...
the one market to the other. But
not black, but grey market, what should I say? The other market, the criminal
legacy market, unregulated.
It's better.
Every single percent that switches is a good percent, and it's something progress.
Mandatory that we stop using the term black market. I think mandatory. That's absolutely don't use it ever again.
Ever again.
Yeah, okay. No. But now, to you, Bob. How does it work in for instance, Colorado? That's how do you get the weed to the consumer? You talked about the distribution model on the one hand.
Sure.
The other thing is how do you grow there? Do you have companies there? Do you have licensed, state-owned weed growing facilities?
So I slightly disagree with what you said. I disagree that when a consumer goes to a dispensary, this is the American way. We want to see 1,000 products. We want to have all of the choices. It doesn't matter necessarily in the first instance how good the quality is.
Okay.
The quality will determine whether I buy that product again. I'm not saying that's the best way that it should happen, but there's not, in my opinion, not in the U.S. that much of a relationship outside of California maybe, and their system, which is very heavily rooted in the traditional or the legacy market. So consumers don't necessarily create that relationship like they did with their guy, the guy that grew great cannabis.
Or their gal.
Or their gal.
Because gals grow great.
Probably the best weed. Probably the best weed. So that's an interesting point. Now, in Colorado and most U.S. states, and this is a model that we're seeing across the world, as you point out, I've worked for 35 countries around the world. When you look at the government always says, oh my goodness, we're doing something that's never been done before. This is going to make us look bad if something happens out there. This is why in the United States, no government official ever moves the policy forward. You know how it happens in the United States? The citizens have to vote for it. Even when you have a politician like the governor of New Jersey, my home state, he was elected and he said, I will legalize adult use cannabis. Well, he ran into a political problem. They had still put it out to the voters. So only one state, that was New York State, with Governor Cuomo, who legalized it, but he did that because he had other problems that were political and in his personal life to distract. So you have to push for it from the citizens. And then it becomes, what are the categories of licensure? At the beginning, you want vertically integrated as a policymaker, because then you only have one person that will be accountable to you in the entire supply chain. That's the problem, though.
Yeah.
You have to build a supply chain state by state by state in the U.S. because the cannabis can't cross over the borders.
Yeah.
So when U.S. legalization discussion comes along, and it's not there yet, despite what you might hear, I'll comment on that if you'd like, but once the legalization discussion comes around, you want to answer to one person and then ultimately figure out how do you convert consumers to that system. And in the U.S., what we've seen is the widest variety of products that are consistent tend to get that. Now there's separated licenses, cultivation, extraction, delivery, retail, consumer clubs and lounges are starting to come around. But we don't necessarily know if that experiment is going to succeed because there are, to your point, so many restrictions on what you can or can't do or can or can't sell in a lounge. You can't even sell food and beverages in some lounges. Well, why would I go to a club and not be able to have a coffee or maybe even a beer or something to eat?
Yes. Yeah.
So keeping all these things separated is because of the fear of the politician and the policymaker of the unknown, despite the fact that we have 50 years of history in a place like the Netherlands and how these things work, despite the fact that we have at least 14 years that I've been working in a commercial regulated space. We know the data, we know the patterns, we know how this is going to turn out. There is no mystery. The patterns exist jurisdiction by jurisdiction around the world, and they evolve the exact same way. It's just different timelines. So we have to stop pretending that this is an experiment and that it's new, because it's not.
It's not new, it's not an experiment.
Yeah.
But it's politically driven, and I really fear for next Tuesday, when the midterm elections are coming along. How do you see that, just to make a sidestep?
Please, though.
No, I was going to talk about, I was finding a thing to argue with you about. So I want to go back to the store with the all of the many products, but you please go ahead.
Yeah, just a sidestep, in terms.
So in the United States, it's likely, more than likely, that the Republicans will take over the House. Not likely the Senate, although we just don't know. The point is, what we're told is that the Democrat policy is about social justice. It's about curing the ills of the past with the failed drug war. The Republican policy, to the extent that there is a policy around cannabis, it's about jobs and the economy. So finally, you see these concepts merged. So what we're hearing, I don't know if this will happen, but what we're hearing is that there's a better than 50% chance during what we call the lame duck session, right? After this election and before the new politicians are sworn in January, that there will be something passed in Congress that will take care of some of the social justice issues and also create access to banking and the capital markets.
Yeah.
If you think what happened in Canada was impressive by having the Toronto and the Canadian Securities Exchange open up and literally bring in billions upon billions upon billions of dollars to deploy in the cannabis space, wait till the U.S. capital markets open up. You ain't seen nothing
yet. Baby. Hilary.
Okay, well now what I want to ask is a little boring
argue.
after that. The shops that you're talking about that have a huge variety of product, are they branded? Is there marketing? So I think maybe that's one of the differences in what we're experiencing in the different markets is that in Canada, no advertising, no branding, no interesting packaging. I mean, the packaging itself has to also be like child-proof, smell-proof, waterproof, bomb-proof.
Yeah, boring.
Boring, but also you can't have any direct communication with the consumer as a producer. So some education happens at the point of sale where the person who's working in retail may like a company or not like a company, or they may have some knowledge or not have any knowledge about how to teach people how to use the product safely. But I think that's where, in my experience in Canada, some of the consumer data that we're seeing, but also just my conversations with consumers, is they end up finding a company that they like, and they like the story of it, right? It might be that they like Greenhouse because they like that they were an original coffee shop and they're doing different cool things around the world and they've got some good sustainability stuff. And so they're more loyal to a company than they are to an individual product is what we've seen, right? So the very constrictive nature of no marketing, no advertising, no branding, basically just like gagged from having any communication with your consumer unless you can find some very smart, sneaky ways to do it, like have great social justice initiatives or really cool community partnerships you can talk about. My biggest concern is that we lost the ability for education, right? So in the medical market, I was able to make brochures and pamphlets and dosing guidelines and give the recommendations to make sure that people weren't having negative experiences. And one of the increases that we have seen that's not good from a public health perspective is more people going to the emergency room because of like cannabis overdoses, right? So we know that it's not lethal. It's not like talking about an opiate overdose, but I think that those would be dramatically reduced if we could loosen up the ability to be able to have the experts in the country be able to create proper education content, right? So a producer has to pay for another organization to write the content, and they need to be hands-off and not have any control over what they write and how it's disseminated.
But on the other side of the scales, there's marketing, branding, and how do you see that? Because that's on the other side of the scale. It educates also.
Well, but I mean, that's part of the point, right? There's a restriction. There are very strict regulations in multiple jurisdictions that tell you how and where and why and how limited you can advertise. And to your point, you can't package things in a way that's attractive to children. As an example, everyone knows who Mike Tyson is, right? Mike Tyson has a brand called Tyson 2.0, and he came out with gummies. What are the gummies shaped like?
Little teddy bears or something?
No, an ear with a bite out of it. Because if you recall, Mike Tyson bit Evander Holyfield's ear, right? Yeah. But this came out. Oh my gosh, what a brilliant marketing strategy. Most states, you can't make it in the shape of an ear because that chewed up ear is attractive to children somehow, some way. You have to make it a square or a round circle. So these are the types of things you deal with on the advertising and marketing side.
But the unregulated market in Canada is branding like crazy. They're making gummies that look like a Skittles package, and they're like sexy and interesting, and like they also have this other kind of advantage in that way, right? I mean, I think that you can regulate advertising, marketing, and branding in a way where you can still do it in a responsible way, but it's one of the key things that's missing from us actually having a vibrant, diverse, interesting market is letting the personalities of the companies come through. And instead what we're seeing in Canada right now is a race to high THC and low cost. And that's kind of boring, actually. The
thing is, if you overregulate, that's the main message. If you overregulate, you end up with having an unregulated market, big market. It will eventually take a big market share. We have something totally different. Taxation in Holland, you're not taxed as you're an entrepreneur in this field, and you can't get a bank account. How does it work in the countries you advise or you live?
You can get bank accounts now. If you have a legal license company.
Legit company, that's no problem.
And the tax is totally out of control. So the main federal tax is based on wholesale sales, not based on retail sales. And the formula is all wrong. They're taxing it, thinking that you're selling cannabis wholesale at $1 per gram. No, $10 per gram. So they think that wholesale price of cannabis is $10 per gram, and then they threw $1 on each one of those grams, and it is not the price that wholesale cannabis is retailing for. And then the provinces each tack a sales tax on top of it, and it varies across the provinces. And so you can be paying up to like 40% at the point of sale that is going to tax. The collective cannabis industry in Canada is well over $1 million in arrears in paying some of the taxes. And if the Canadian Revenue Agency called them all in, we'd have a bunch of companies in receivership. Like, it has to get readjusted in order for survival. And the other big bug for me is that we're taxing patients. So prescription medicines, when your physician authorizes you something, it's free of sales tax in Canada, and we're still managing it in a way where patients are getting taxed. In a perfect regulatory scheme for me, the recreational market would subsidize patients. because it's going to be a long time, I think, before the formularies are covering insurance for patients, which is really what we need, is cost coverage. And it's so important to me that we keep patients at the front and center of these conversations, because at least in my country and many of your states, fighting for medical rights is what was the thin edge of the wedge. And now we can't just suddenly just like abandon patients and patients' needs. So my dream is to, maybe you can do it in Germany, is to see a model where there is tax from the rec that ends up funding patients.
Yeah, good idea. Huh?
At least what people and politicians in Germany understood is that the price must be competing to the black market, and the tax must be adjusted when the black markets react on legalization, lowering the price. Then state must follow fast with lower taxes. That's what they have in mind, and I think that will work somehow. We are discussing now founding the taxes on THC levels. But just the more THC, the more taxes, and as the only thing to put the tax on. But still, not too much. That's what they understood. So I'm cool with that.
They looked at that in Canada, and I will see if I can dig up the documents and the arguments that got us over that hump when we were looking through this in our Senate, because that was one of the schemes that was proposed as well.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go to a closure, I think. One of the things I would like to know from either of you, Bob for instance, if you would copy one of the things we have in Holland right now, I think you're going to say it's coffee shops. That's what I would love to copy. That's the thing. What would you not especially have from Holland? What's the biggest mistake we make at this moment?
Pretending that the coffee shops don't exist. I mean, that's a mistake, right?
That's a mistake.
I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, although politics never makes sense, right? But when you have coffee shops and you have supply to the coffee shops, why are we talking about creating an industry that we should regulate when it already exists? It just, I'm not saying the coffee shops would even want a license, but if you were to change the structure, it's all there. You can have testing, you can have a supply chain, you can have the consumer protections in place. So that's the thing. And the other thing is, I find this very interesting. I have many Dutch friends, and as I mentioned, I've come here since 1993, many times. There seems to be a disconnect with the cannabis culture and mainstream Dutch culture in the sense that we don't want to talk about our cannabis use. Why? Why not change that and just normalize it or be proud of it or accept it? Because that's what we're starting to see around the rest of the world, especially as we heard in the last panel, when you compare alcohol to cannabis use.
Cannabis, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's the one thing that I'd love to see changed, and I don't know how you change that, but presumably it's cultural.
It's cultural, and I can explain a bit. If you ask any Dutchman what his salary is, what his income is, he won't give you an answer. If you ask an American, he will say instantly how many money he makes. That's the thing, I think.
Yeah, but it's also a question of EU law, I think, EU law, European Union. The Netherlands had the same problem as we, as Germany, have now, that it's not really compatible to the European law framework, or at least it's a political question if it is or not. And all the neighbors all the time went to the Netherlands. Every time an interior minister of France or Belgium or Germany came here, they were talking about everything, and then, but your coffee shops are very bad,
that's
forbid them, get rid of them, and so on. So since more than 30 years or 40 or what, the Netherlands go through this, all this bullshit bingo with us also, with Germany also, and stood firm, keeping up the coffee shops, and that's worth a compliment to the Netherlands, I would say. That's
they're still there.
Something strong stand against all those critics, and in this direction, maybe Germany could really make a difference now to get the pressure out of the system. It's a little bit like since 10 years ago, maybe, I heard all the time when I was talking about legalization from the others, well, you might be right, but we can't do it alone because of America. The US will make us so much stress and terror, and that's nothing we can discuss.
Yeah.
They will.
That changed.
They will put it out of our hands.
Yeah.
And that pressure is out of the system, and now the whole world is open to think about it.
Yeah.
And maybe Germany has a little bit like this role in Europe. Like we and Holland and everybody said, well, we might legalize, but like Luxembourg said, they wanted to legalize, and they said, well, it's not possible because of Europe.
Oh, it's Hilary
and now maybe we are opening up this door.
The second biggest economy in Europe could be the game changer. What would you?
I was going to say, I remember the question. I have two comments.
Yeah.
One is, if there was something from Holland that I would take back to Canada, it would be a whole lot of imported dark hash. Because we make some beautiful hash in Canada, ice hash, bubble hash, but it is not like the Nepalese and Moroccan hash that I've had in the last couple of days since I've been here. Difficult from a regulatory perspective in terms of how to import it and make it legal, but big.
It's good for the good
just
stuff.
freighters of it, please. And then I also just want to say, as we're getting close to the end of time, that I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Holland and the coffee shop owners and the pioneers of the freedom and the coffee shops that are here in Holland. I lived here 1995, and Bernard hired me at Positronics. How many of you remember Positronics or have been to Posi? Yeah, so I got to work there for a year as a Canadian without a European passport who didn't speak Dutch, but amazingly he hired me. And I spent a year distributing hash and grass and hanging out in that amazing cantina and serving lunch and meeting with incredible teachers of mine who are kind of the greats whose shoulders I stand on now today, like their experience. And I learned what it was like to distribute cannabis in an environment that was free of prohibition. I learned what it felt like to be free and open and for it to be normalized and to have no shame and no fear. And I took that back to Canada, and when I started the Compassion Club, which was the first medical dispensary in Canada, I tried to create an environment that was like Positronics, where it was open and there's no secrecy and you're buying your cannabis right there. And I think that cultural teaching that I got 25 years ago, if I hadn't had that, I wouldn't have started the Compassion Club perhaps at all, or not in the way that I did. And we wouldn't have started a medical movement across the country that eventually has turned into medical and recreational legalization. And so I'm so grateful to the forefathers and foremothers of the freedoms that you have taught us in Holland, and what a cool full circle it is for me to get to come back and talk to you about how the experiment has worked in Canada with legalization and what you should take and what you should leave behind. So thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. Thanks to all of you. Thanks, Georg. Thanks, Hilary. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.